Hello, dear students. I have here a presentation for week 2 on Plato's Apology. I've decided to title this after the closing sentence of the Apology, known to no one except the God, and subtitled Socrates in Defense of Ignorance. So this dialogue is purportedly Socrates' defense of himself at his trial, but I think it helps to maybe think of it also as his defense of his philosophical commitments. The main point, the thesis of Socrates' defense is that Socrates has not taught the youth corrupting doctrines because he does not teach them at all. Rather, he is on a divine mission to expose false wisdom. Reasons to think this is the main point is that this is how Socrates responds actually directly to Meletus's charge. But he claims that he's never accepted money for teaching, that he's never claimed to teach. He just talks to people, and it just so happens that the young men listen in. And he considers himself entrusted with a mission from the gods. This is really important, right? It's sort of a Blues Brothers thing going on here. I'm on a mission from God. Socrates thinks he's supposed to question those who claim they know things that they do not know. As far as a summary of this text goes, the intro in our edition of the text is really helpful. It gives a numbered breakdown of the different sections of the Apology, and I think that's really helpful. So I'm going to summarize what I take to be the main points of Socrates' sort of defense of his philosophical commitments. There's so much going on in this Apology. I couldn't possibly put it all in a short presentation of the length that y'all are supposed to do for your presentations. So first off, note that really a lot of what Socrates talks about isn't a defense of himself against the charges given. In fact, he starts by saying that he really thinks the reason he's on trial is because of what he calls his first accusers, and that it's not even anyone in particular, it's just this sort of build-up of mischaracterization and resentment against him in Athens, right? He mentions Aristophanes and the clouds, but in general, it's just people have this idea of Socrates where they either make fun of him or they're mad at him. And he thinks that really has a lot to do with why he's on trial versus the actual charges given. It's in this context of answering his first accusers that he recounts the story of his friend's visit to the oracle at Delphi, where the friend asks, "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" And the oracle, speaking for the god, says, "No." Socrates thinks this is very strange because he says, "I don't know anything." His interpretation is that Socrates is wise because, whereas other people claim to know things they don't know, Socrates says, "I do not think I know what I do not know," and he's willing to admit that. When you get to the actual charges against Socrates, his main argument against Meletus, the actual charges given, corrupting the youth, atheism, is a reductio type argument that shows that Socrates cannot be willfully corrupting the youth because if people are bad, then they'll harm you. And so if you make them bad, you'll bring harm to yourself, but no one wants to bring harm to themselves. So he wouldn't possibly do this thing. So either he doesn't do it at all or he does it by accident without knowing he's doing it. Either way, he should be let off. And then he counters the charge of atheism with another kind of show up of contradiction. He claims that someone teaching about spiritual things must believe in gods because gods are the source of spiritual things. This is actually a relatively short part of the Apology, right? He thinks that Meletus's charges are really kind of trumped up. So ultimately, Socrates is confident in his own character. He seems to think that you get the sense that he knows the outcome of this trial ahead of time, that he has a pretty good sense of what's going to happen. And one of the things I want to focus on is that he calls the fear of death a false wisdom. So Socrates' interpretation again of the oracle is that human wisdom isn't about knowing things, it's just about a sort of epistemic humility, admitting that you don't know something if you don't know it. I think it's important that he's not saying that ignorance is a virtue. It's not good to not know things. It's just when you don't know things, accept that and admit that. So Socrates' own valuation of his life is that he's taken on a public service to the god of the gadfly who wakes up the sleeping horse of Athens. Essentially, he knows that he's been pissing off people all over Athens, and Euthyphro you can think of as kind of an example of the kind of conversation that got Socrates into this trial. But again, he considers it a mission from God to go around and question people who claim they know things and show that they don't actually know them. He seems to think that the charges of corrupting the youth and atheism really smokescreens. Really, people just want to shut him up. And that's why they put him in a position where his options are pretty much to be banished or to die, and it ends up being death. This is an idiosyncratic conception, perhaps, of wisdom, that wisdom is just admitting you don't know things, but it has an interesting effect when we think about death, right? So Socrates says since we don't know what happens after death, we shouldn't fear it. If we think that death is bad, that implies that we know something about it that we don't know, and so we shouldn't fear death. It might be neutral, it might be good. He gives some arguments to think that that might be the case. But we do know that it's bad to be a bad person. So Socrates really tries to show his character versus the character of the people who sentence him to death and his accusers. And he wants to show that the really important thing is to focus on one's character and to do what is right, because you know that that's good, and you know that it's bad to be a bad person. You don't know that death is bad. And so the choice should always be to choose one's character, even if that means, as he says at one point, running the ultimate risk.